choices shape the market, our society, and our quality of life. That's why Euroconsumers helps millions of people in their daily choices, providing simple solutions to complex problems. Euroconsumers is a cluster of organizations, a network of people, a group established to protect consumer rights and well-being that brings consumers and companies together in transparent relationships of trust that respect their independence. Our deep understanding of products and consumption gives consumers a credible, expert voice worldwide. We bridge the gap between buyers and manufacturers, between supply and demand. And in this digital age, we create opportunities for all parties to come together in constructive dialogue, partnering to build a future of better products and services. Euroconsumers has the power of a global group that believes humanity can develop, grow, and change for the better, and that we can promote this by uniting millions of consumers in strength and speaking responsibly for them, while simultaneously engaging in relationships of trust with responsible, sustainable companies.
Welcome to Start Talking. This is the first Start Talking of 2024, and my colleague Luca's reminded me that we're now entering our third year of these webinars, so we're really pleased with that. And for those of you who've watched them before, you'll know we cover a wide range of topics, all related to consumers in some way. So we've looked at crypto, influencers, food prices, inflation, of course, ChatGPT. So we're really pleased to be entering our third year of Start Talking, and especially pleased with the panel that we have with us today. So welcome to everybody who's watching live, and to everyone who will be listening or watching the recording. My name's Liz Cull, and I'll be your host for today. Today, we're going to be asking if the global trade system, which we all rely on, is failing or serving consumers, and whether we're seeing perhaps a shift towards more protectionist system that prioritizes national economies over globalization, and what that all means. So to explore all of that, we'll be looking at the benefits and downsides of global trade for consumers, where perhaps trade might have struggled or be struggling to deliver on the wider, say, non-economic outcomes like climate goals or the Sustainable Development Goals, labour rights, security, trust, etc. And we'll also be asking what are the wider political issues at stake at the moment. Now, trade is such a huge issue covering almost every sector that we've chosen to focus on two specific areas to hone down the discussion a bit. So, and they're also hot topics at the moment. So we'll be looking at food and farming and electric vehicles, and we'll come on to those later. But to help us navigate through all of these topics, I'm delighted to welcome to Start Talking's 5 excellent participants. And I'm going to start by introducing Leah. Leah Offray leads the International Affairs team coordinating BEIC's policies in free trade agreements, customs, and international cooperation between regulators. She's also co-chair of the Trade Committee of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue. And for those of you who don't know, BEIC is the European Consumer Organisation. So welcome, Leah. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Next up, we have Rodrigo Carcamo Diaz, who's got a very long job title, so bear with me, Chief of Commodities Policy Implementation and Outreach in the Division of International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD. UNCTAD is the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and his department covers international trade and commodities. Rodrigo's worked for over 20 years on different development issues, and his current research is focused on agricultural value chains for exports in developing countries. And he's also organised many international policy events, including the Global Commodities Forum. So welcome, Rodrigo. We're delighted to have you with us today. Next, we have Antonino Serra Cambaceras, who is joining us from the Dominican Republic. He's the Director of Projects and International Relations for Adelco. Adelco are the oldest consumer association in Argentina, where he's from, and in fact, the oldest in Latin America. So a real history there of consumer rights in Latin America. Antonino also works as an international consultant in projects with ISO, the International Standards Organization, the European Union, Central American Consumer Council, and FIAC, which is the Ibero-American Forum of Government Consumer Protection Agencies. For 25 years, he worked at Consumers International in the Latin American and Caribbean office and also on global protection legal issues throughout that region and globally. So welcome, Antonino. We're delighted to have you here. Next, we have Harold Past, who is Head of Trade and Taxation at Eurocommerce. He represents European retail and wholesale sector, focuses on EU trade policy, including bilateral trade agreements, GSP, although I'm not sure what that is, but I'm sure you can tell us, and market access, and also on digital trade and taxation. And we're hoping that we'll be joined shortly by Stefano Duempoli. I'm sure he'll be coming online soon. Here he is. Welcome, Stefano, just in time. Very well done. He's the President and Principal Policy Analyst at ICOM, which is the Institute for Competitiveness, founded in Rome in 2005 by Stefano, and now also based in Brussels. And he also teaches political economy and economic policy at the Roma Tre University in Rome. So welcome, everybody. Really pleased that you're here. But remember, everyone watching at home, you're also part of Start Talking as well. So please put your questions to the panelists and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And we'll be live tweeting this webinar. And if you want to join in, you can use hashtag Start Talking. And you can also follow at Euroconsumers on LinkedIn and on X for all of the most important current and future consumer news. Okay, let's get down to the topic then. I've got some opening questions which are going to try to unpack a little bit what the benefits of global trade are. So I'm going to start with you, Leah. Can you tell us a little bit about your role at BEIC and then also how global trade and global trade agreements benefit consumers, countries and economies?
Yeah, thank you very much, Liz, for having me, and thank you to Euroconsumers as well. Well, my role at BEIC, so the European Consumer Organization, is that I lead their international affairs team. And as you said, so we focus on various issues. So trade policy first, because we've been created this branch at BEIC at least when Europe and the United States started to launch their trade negotiation that some of you might remember under the name of TTIP. And so we started to look at this angle and then at other trade agreements and little by little, we started also to look at the necessity for authorities protecting consumers to work together in Europe and outside, and also at issues like customs control, which are really important. And to come back to your question, why does trade matter for, well, consumers, the economy and country? Well, trade is really important in the everyday life of consumers. I mean, the life of consumers in Europe and elsewhere wouldn't really be imaginable without trade flows. The food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, the products that we use in our everyday, this is also coming from flows from outside of Europe, for instance. So it really matters, and having trade flows open is really key also to make sure that people can access the different goods and services. But of course, from the BEIC perspective, we think that it's really important also to have at least trade agreements, for instance, that really benefit consumers and that looking at benefiting consumers, something that we do not really see at the moment, and also that are sustainable. And here again, we can explore that later, but there are some shortcomings lately on trade policy, at least on the European side, where sometimes we can have trade policy clashing with internal policies like the Green Deal, but I'd be happy to tell you more in a minute.
We'll hear a bit more about that later. Thank you. And to you, Harold, I've got the same question, but thinking from a business perspective, what do Euroconsumers members that you represent, and you can tell us a little bit about who they are, what do they gain from global trade, and how do trade agreements help deliver this?
Yeah, many thanks for organizing this really great session. I'm grateful to be here today. And yeah, you have kindly introduced myself. I'm working with Eurocommerce. So this is the European association representing the retail and wholesale sector. Here we talk about 5 million companies in the EU, which are creating 27 million jobs. So from SMEs, which are 99% of our membership, so to say, to also multinational enterprises, so really broad. So, but what they really have in common is to have global trade in their DNA. So store shelves would look quite differently if we wouldn't make use of the opportunity to trade globally. And of course, this has several reasons. Some of the products are not available in Europe or not of the quantity we need. Just think of bananas. Of course, we have excellent bananas in the Canary Islands and also in the French overseas departments, but not nearly sufficient to cover consumer demands in Europe. But it is also about maximizing choice and options for consumers. This leads to global innovation and makes also sure that goods produced in Europe will improve and get better. So global trade is also about learning from each other. But also price is an important factor. Price levels of different input factors are different, and raw materials might be better available elsewhere and therefore cheaper, but also labor costs are not the same. They are not the same within the EU neither, by the way. And yeah, not least, this is really important also for our companies. We talk a lot about diversifying supply chains these days, but being dependent on only one or too few trading partners could lead to an undesired dependency of only one trading partner. Now, coming to trade agreements more generally, I think it is important to give companies access to global markets to exactly avoid this scenario of dependencies. Therefore, it is important to facilitate international trade further, while of course not compromising on standards. Also, let's not forget that opening up international trade is never a one-way street, but also gives other countries the opportunity to succeed in Europe. So in the best case, it should be a win-win situation.
Okay, thank you very much. And that leads nicely into Antonino's question about trade not being a one-way street. So you've worked for many years in national, regional and international consumer organizations. So for this question to you, I'm interested in the perspective from a developing and emerging economies of the value of trade, and then the reality as well as the theory.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy, very pleased to be here with you today. I should say that what my colleagues that talked before me mentioned, I subscribe 100%. I mean, things that consumers benefit from trade are more access to goods and services, and that enhances the right of choice, one of the 8 consumer rights, the right to choose. But also, and more important from my point of view, is the first one, consumer right, which is the right of satisfaction of the basic needs. Because trade can enhance the possibility of consumers to access those basic or to satisfy those basic needs and to access to products and services that are better quality, that are more widely available. And in the wider perspective, it leads for developing countries to do 2 things that for me are essential, are in the heart of trade and consumer protection, which is trade can help to tackle poverty and inequality in developing countries. And this is because enhanced trade can bring more opportunities for work for consumers and for workers that will have a better and a positive effect in societies in developing countries. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for consumers to benefit from trade, and also being, and this is very important, of being part of the trade discussion, because we know that consumers are essential to that.
Okay, so they shouldn't just be these passive beneficiaries, but they need to be involved in how the agreements are happening. And I think that's been quite challenging over the years, to say the least. Just an opening remarks now from Rodrigo as well. You work in an international organisation. It's called the Body for Trade and Development. So in your view, what role can trade play in raising prosperity generally?
Yes, thank you, Liz, for the invitation. Also, very happy to be here. I am probably having to repeat what some of the previous speakers said before, but I'm going to try to add something to the discussion. Okay. First, I think that trade is very important to improve livelihoods because, like it was said before, it expands availability and choices of products to consumers. And let's give you some numbers. For example, without trade, products that everybody consumes regularly in middle income and upper income, in upper or developed countries, like cocoa or coffee or exotic fruits would not be available. Just to give you an idea of the size of this trade, coffee in between 2019 and 21 on average was 42 billion. Chocolate and cocoa was 53 billion. And fruit and preparations, 176 billion. So we're talking about very large amounts of products that are sold and bought in different countries. Another important thing is that trade allows many products to be available all year round, for example, which is important for fruits and vegetables, that without trade would not be possible. You know, this counter season growing when it's winter or summer in different places. So that is also an important driver for trade. And like Antonino was mentioning, this trade allows developing countries which need to import large quantities of cereals and other staple foods to complement domestic production. This is very important because unfortunately there is a lot of people who have problems accessing to food. In 2022, there were 735 million undernourished people around the world and 900 million severely food insecure people. So we're talking about large numbers of people who depend on trade to feed themselves. That is one issue. And the other one is, like Antonino and other speakers were saying, this allows developing country producers to raise their prosperity. There are a very large number of countries who are dependent on exporting and producing a very small amount of products. For example, there are 35 countries, half of which are located in Africa, that export only one product line. So being able to export to other markets allows them to diversify and to grow and to reduce poverty levels.
Okay, thank you very much. Stefano, we'll come to you next. I'm going to ask you sort of two sides of a question. So firstly, the positives. Tell us how global trade contributes to competitiveness, which is what your institute is interested in. But also, could you tell us a bit about this potential rise of protectionism? So why do you think some countries are taking this path, and how is that going to impact consumers?
Thanks for the two questions. First of all, I totally agree that global trade brings enormous benefits, both to competitiveness and consumers at the end. So I think there is a perfect alignment between the two, competitiveness and the consumer interests. This happens because basically trade is based on competitive advantages, and so it allows for an efficient allocation of resources, where the resources are used more efficiently in a way. And thanks to this economic mechanism, at the end, innovation can contribute positively to economic growth and is stimulated by this efficient allocation of resources and productive factors. And so the final achievement basically is competitiveness. That means, on the one hand, more profits for the innovative firms, but on the other hand, lower costs and good quality goods and services for consumers. And so in that way, in the long term, I see a perfect alignment between a win-win situation, as someone said before. However, unfortunately, it seems to me that the conditions for a real global and free trade are put in danger by the actions of many states, and it's not only protectionism that, of course, is a direct factor obstructing free trade, of course. But you have also more subtle forms of so-called mercantilism. What do they mean? I mean, protectionism, of course, traditional protectionism is imposing fees on imports, on imported goods, or forbid goods, important goods at all. Mercantilism works in a slightly different and, as I said before, subtler way, in the sense that you tend to discriminate foreign firms in, for instance, forcing them to invest in a country in order to guarantee the access to that country, or other forms that break one fundamental rule of free trade, that is reciprocity, of course, reciprocity of conditions, of commercial conditions. And so my hope is that, of course, Europe, as a European, Europe is still holding a position of openness towards other countries, but at the same time, of course, we have to pay attention to the fact that there is reciprocity from the other nations, and this is something that it's important, because otherwise trade is not fair. At that point, you have some actors that are favored by how the system works compared with us, with European players.
Okay, yeah. So that's interesting. So there's more factors than just protectionism. There's other things going on which are limiting trade. But Antonino, the option of protectionism, of course, isn't open to all countries, and particularly small states. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, Lisa, and let me put an example. I'm working with Central America countries and on consumer protection issues, and last year I was there. And there was a problem in El Salvador, because El Salvador, which is the tiniest country in Central America, it's dependable almost for every product and service. And the main provider at hand is Guatemala, who is a neighboring country. Now, Guatemala in that moment, at the end of last year, had a political problem with all the turmoils and people demonstrating in the street, and they closed the frontiers, so the borders. So one of the things that they are trying to say, well, how we can replace all the stuff, all the food mainly that we need. And then you see the value of trade, then open markets, possibilities of accessing other markets in a rapid way and without barriers. It's essential for these kind of countries. And that's something that trade can help to ensure those people that have, as I mentioned before, the satisfaction of their basic needs. So protectionism is also, and this is my personal view, against consumer rights, because protectionism can harm those rights of consumers that satisfying the basic need, the choice, and so many other things that even to a healthy environment. So I think that I hope that this example can explain a bit.
Yeah, that's a good example, because I think in some countries you can see why it would be tempting to help boost your own economy, but it's not an option that's open to everybody and can have quite negative effects for those smaller countries. The other word we hear a lot about at the moment, particularly, is this idea of a trade war. So Harold, I'm going to ask you to explain what is it? What happens in a trade war? How do they come about? And why do we want to avoid them?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. I think, well, the word war is a word we hear all too often these days, very sadly. And of course, in a trade war or in a conflict, so to say, people do not need to fear about their lives, but still economic consequences can be significant. So, and I've been working long enough in the sector to remember the most recent and prominent trade war between the US and the EU, which started in 2018 under the Trump administration. So in an attempt under the motto America First, the US has introduced 25% tariffs on steel and 10% tariffs on aluminium coming from the EU. So bizarrely, this was justified under the so-called Section 232, very technical, but meaning that they claimed the imports were a threat to national security. So these measures had an impact of around, I believe, more than $7 billion of imports to the US. And as a consequence, EU exports of steel and aluminium have dropped by 53% only between 2018 and 2020. So now why am I telling this, and why should this matter to consumers who rarely buy steel or aluminium? So the EU, of course, has reacted to the US measures and has not only launched a legal complaint at the WTO, but has also introduced rebalancing measures with the aim to hurt the US economy. So we have seen tariffs on popular US products as bourbon whiskey, was jeans, motorbikes with a value compared to the US measures that they were actually in place on steel and aluminium. So this is when consumers were directly affected by a trade war. Now, how did the story end? In fact, it is not fully over. When Biden administration took office, both sides agreed to suspend the measures, but only temporarily until the end of last year. And together with other stakeholders, we were pushing to get a permanent solution on this. However, just before Christmas, the EU and US only agreed to suspend the measures for another 2 years until March 2025. Now, considering the upcoming US elections in November, we might see a comeback of the tariffs next year to the disadvantage of businesses and also to consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. So to conclude, trade wars do have an immediate effect, not only on big enterprises, as many might think, but also on consumers in the daily shopping experience.
Thanks, Harold. So yeah, I think it's interesting to get behind the headlines of things that seem quite technical and far away, and actually what that means. So Leah, I'm going to bring you back in here, because you've worked in this area for a long time. Do you think these kinds of trade wars, disputes and disagreements are becoming more common? And if so, what's behind that?
Thank you, Liz. Yes, indeed. I mean, this is something, not necessarily trade wars or disputes per se, but like at least threats of entering into disputes. That's something we're seeing more and more, this kind of game that can be, as Harold just said, very problematic for consumers. Because one thing to keep in mind is like when tariffs are raised, this is directly felt by consumers, contrary to tariff reductions that we feel a bit less, but tariff increase that can be really problematic for consumers. But I just would like to come back quickly before on the notion of protectionism as well, because that's something that is also related to this increase of trade threats of disputes, because the more and more, for instance, in the EU, we're having regulations to help consumers, so to protect them in the market, but also to help them in the green transition, for instance. And generally, we're being attacked by other countries who consider that these are protectionist measures. These are creating barriers to trade, and this is something. So we are seeing this a lot in the field of environmental and sustainability, but also from our partners whenever we regulate the digital environment. So when the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act came up, the first reaction of some of our partners, well, we might launch a trade litigation because this is creating barriers to trade. And the EU also, use a bit that game and blame game in using trade rules when the Inflation Reduction Act was announced. And the first reflex was to say, we might do some trade retaliation. So it's important for countries to be very careful about this because it has implications for consumers, for companies, and that it also brings a very negative image of trade rules that are not supposed to be used like this. So we need to align on what is actually protectionism and alleviate a bit all those tensions. And really the solution is that we need more dialogue, because there are some dialogues happening. Sides are listening to each other, but not really hearing each other. So we need to find some solution here.
Okay, thank you. So you're sort of saying one area's high standards is another person's accusation of protectionism, and that's quite hard to come by. So you mentioned some of the sort of environmental and sustainability measures causing, let's say, disagreement. So we said we were going to focus a bit on some of those specifics, and an interesting piece of research and testing has come out of Testachat or Testancoup, who are a member of Euroconsumers. They're a consumer testing organization and have been doing that for many decades. And they've been testing cars for many, many decades. And we've got a short video here from one of their car testing team who've recently run some tests and assessments on electric vehicles, in particular those that have been imported from China. So if you just take a look at this short film.
Testancoup and all the Euroconsumer partners is partner of Euro NCAP, stands for European New Car Assessment Program, and there we found it important to have a look at the quality of the Chinese cars. I remember one of the first weeks I was in Testancoup where a Chinese car was launched on the market, and we were all very surprised, and the quality and the price was very good until we conducted a crash test, and there the result was only 1 star out of 5, so a really disappointing result, and the Chinese car disappeared from the market very quickly. But now, 20 years later, almost 20 years later, we see that the results of the Euro NCAP crash test of Chinese electrical cars are very good. We had a look at the results of the electric Chinese cars tested in 2023. We found 8 of them with brands as Build Your Dreams, BYD, NIO, XPeng, and all the 8 cars scored a maximum of 5 stars on this Euro NCAP crash test. And that means immediately that all of the 4 safety pillars there also the scores were very high. Well, at least you see, if you are, as a consumer, are thinking of buying a Chinese car, then at least you know that the crash test safety is on top.
Thanks very much to Steve there. So it's an interesting message, isn't it? Because a consumer testing organisation communicating results of that assessment to consumers would say 5 stars. We've got great safety, great price, a really good quality vehicle. But obviously there's more to the story behind the scenes. So Stefano, what does this say more broadly about how well the EU vehicle industry is able to meet demands? What do you make of it?
I think it shows that unfortunately European producers, automakers didn't invest that much or at least that efficiently in order to meet demand. And so, of course, the penetration in terms of market rate of Chinese automakers is rising very fast. So I think this is the main message. I think that still there is some room for doing better in terms of European automakers, but I think it's a sort of alarm sounding very, very high. In any case, I think if you don't prove that Chinese automakers did something wrong in terms of being held against trade rules and so on, I think that is fair. I mean, is an effect of more efficiency that of course can be justified in several manners, but after all it benefits consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. But Leah, what do you make of this? Do you see that as a sort of failure of the EU to, persuade its legacy industries to adapt? And then what does that say about achieving a green transition where Europe can also remain competitive?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Well, this, I think, definitely this case of electric vehicles in China and the ongoing investigation happening in the EU, it's also a wake-up call for the European car manufacturers in Europe that they've missed a big segment of the market, a big part of the consumer demand. It's very important to see that the market has focused so far, the offer really on big cars, quite expensive cars that consumers are not necessarily able to afford. And it's not really making the sustainable choice, the easy choice right now for consumers. So for us, it's really a wake-up call for car manufacturers in Europe that they need also to do better and to provide some to the demand, the real demand of consumers, because often we hear that it's the fault of consumers. They want big SUVs, they want banana from Ecuador, they want all of these products. But actually, consumers are not the one that are actually putting everything on display in the supermarkets or in the market in general. So we need to find some common ground here. And yes, for us, definitely, this is a wake-up call, and we'll follow with interest what's going to happen next. And I think the test also from Testachat, Testancop, who are also a BEUC member, are quite good also to trigger the discussion that how can we reach that balance that is missing now on the market.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. You see it quite positively as saying, actually, maybe this is prove the demand, so that then EU-based manufacturers can step in. So there'd been like a test run of market research. But yeah, I found it really interesting, because for every grand strategy and policy and economic strategy that the EU has, if you're offering a consumer a really well-performing electric vehicle and they want to buy it, then ultimately that's what's going to matter when they're making that choice, and not all these big, high-level trade discussions. Does anyone else want to come in on this, or shall we move on to food and farming, which has been another topic in the news? Should we have we asked a group called Copper Cogeca, who's represent farmers and agricultural cooperatives across Europe. And we wanted, because obviously there's been a lot of high profile protests across Europe and in Britain as well, and lots of tractors on the road, and that's resulted in some concessions being made in the EU strategy. But we wanted to hear from the representatives of the farmers and producers, and we asked them the question of whether they thought the global trade system was failing their industry. So let's hear from Ksenia, who's from COPA.
Many benefits to the global trade in agriculture, from which our producers benefit as well. However, there are many issues in the system. We do see the competitiveness of the European farmers and our agriculture severely impacted. This has both to do with the not so well functioning WTO system, but also the bilateral and trade agenda of the European Union. The reason why so many farmers perceive their competitiveness to be impacted by these agreements, because the same production standards are not applied to the third country partners. European agriculture is one of the most sustainable agriculture in the world. Actually, they trade on a global market. They are in competition with their farming colleagues from the US, Canada, and other parts of the world. So they see their competitiveness being impacted because they have to carry the burden of these regulations, and they have less and less tools in their toolbox, tools that are available to their competitors. So right now, yes, the cumulative impact of these agreements, the market access that is granted, and the whole situation of the regulatory push that there is from the European Union towards more sustainability is impacting them, because they do not see who pays for this transition, and they do not also see enough time for this transition.
So really interesting points there. I think saying there's a cost to this transition, and it's not always obvious who's paying for it. Clearly thinks that Ksenia clearly thinks there that the farmers are paying maybe too high a price for the sustainability policies. I'm just going to hand it, Harold. I'll just give you the floor now for you know a lot more about the farm to fork and how this is impacting your members. So could you comment on what you make of the sort of recent protests and the concessions that have been made to farmers?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Of course, I cannot speak on behalf of the farmers. I would never do that. But of course, we also represent, for instance, agri-food traders. And the protests we have seen are indeed partially linked to trade policy. And I do believe that it is indeed important that trade policy serves the interests of all stakeholders. Now, we have seen the focus by farmers were mainly on negative consequences of trade agreements. However, we have seen that the agri-sector has also benefited from recent trade liberalizations. If we just look at the recent EU-Japan agreement, which provides better access to Japanese consumers, or take the example of European wine producers, I'm sure like lower tariffs could also create an opportunity to succeed better on markets abroad, elsewhere, be it in South America or somewhere else. But I think one message I would like to leave also for the next Commission mandate that is ahead of us. I think it will be important to better link green policy initiatives to the impact it has on international trade. The EU has brought many measures in place, and some of them were named. If we think of deforestation, if we think of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and also the ongoing initiatives on due diligence or the fight against forced labor, all very important. But it is also true that some of these measures have been introduced at rather short notice, which not only creates challenges for EU companies, but for EU companies and also farmers alike, of course, but also for companies in third countries. And I think it will be increasingly difficult for the EU to resolve trade barriers with partners when they have the impression that the EU is making trade more difficult. So more efforts are needed to achieve, I think, global solutions to protect the environment than so far. And I think this will be an important message for the new legislative period.
Okay, I'm going to jump then to Antonino, because just picking up that point that Harold's made, and I know you don't speak for policymakers in the Mercosur countries, but could you give your perspective? You know, you live in a country that's part of Mercosur, and you've probably been watching what's been happening with interest. So what's your view?
Well, not tricky question, but you know, for Latin America, for Mercosur countries, we are wishing to have a trade agreement with the European Union, because that will mean better quality of our products, because if you have to cope with higher standards in many cases, in your internal markets, you will have better quality products, more availability, and better rules and standards. So I think that we are looking forward to that.
So your point being that if you have to meet higher standards for an external market, you will also raise those internally because it's more efficient just to have one set. Okay.
Indeed. But I also I remember that Stefano mentioned reciprocity, and sometimes that word can be can different meanings one side or the other of the Atlantic, because, for example, no one can be against fighting deforestation. For example, in Brazil, in the Amazon, I mean, who is going to say, well, let's deforest? No, not at all. So let's work together to have that not happening. But then when you say, okay, let's see how we trade our goods with you, and say, no, wait. We have the tractors in the streets or in the routes in Europe, and I can understand what farmers want in Europe. But I think that sometimes it's good or have a better understanding of what farmers in this part of the world are waiting for or are expecting. So we need to have a balance. And sometimes I feel that balance. In the end, there are consumers, and sometimes trade is making, or trade, I don't say barriers, but trade problems are affecting directly to consumers, because the benefits of trade are not being seen by everyday consumers, and sometimes that can be a very difficult thing to advance into better stages, I should say. So that's it. I mean, but all Mercosur countries, and I include here, at least in Argentina, and consumer associations or organizations, we want that because we are sure that it's going to be better for our consumers. But again, we want to be part of the discussions too. Sometimes we are left a bit behind of that.
Okay, thank you. Leo, you wanted to come in quickly on this.
Yeah, thank you. Because I think it's important also to clarify that, of course, I mean, we need, especially in Europe, to better explain the measures that we're adopting, and to be sure that third countries won't see this as being imposed on them and something that is unfair and creating barriers to trade. But my message also for the next commission would also be stick to your gun, because consumers want to change their habits, especially their food habit and consumption habit, and consume more sustainably. So we cannot have concessions on the farm to fork strategy, even if we can fully sympathize with farmers, with the retailers. We need to find common ground, but without backtracking on what was planned. And here it's really important not to get away from what we need to do urgently because of climate change for the sake of trade. And so, of course, we need more dialogue. And this, it's important, I think, also to clarify that for instance, with third countries, there is a lot of work that is being done by the EU, by the Commission, especially in the World Trade Organization, for instance, to explain every time the measures. So I hear Harald for the sector, of course, but for third countries, sometimes there is also this perspective that, we're over criticizing in the EU, and there is a real effort, at least to dialogue. So we can do definitely better, I'm sure, but we really need to continue progressing on sustainability and environmental protection. That is not an option.
I just wonder if I could challenge you a little bit on that, Leah, saying that consumers want this. And again, I would not disagree that most people would want to be purchasing food which doesn't harm the climate and the planet and which has a positive effect. But we're in a cost of living crisis. So there's possibly also the reality that if it's possible to get cheaper prices, then many consumers will feel that is their priority. So I don't know if you've got a response to that, or if it's just one of those big challenges that we haven't yet figured out.
No. I mean, on this, and we have specific figures. Like there is a very significant amount of consumers when our members, so national consumer organization, survey consumer. There is a clear willingness of consuming differently, more sustainably, and also to bear the increase of cost, even in the cost of living crisis. So that is something that, from what our members are seeing from consumers, this is something that consumers are ready to go. But of course, it means that we also going to need to help them make the sustainable, the easy choice.
Yeah, absolutely. So we both, Harold and Leah, have moved on to what they want to ask of the Commission. We also did ask that of COPA, and we said what needs to change so that trade can benefit the environment, farming industry, and consumers. And so we'll just hear their final comments on that.
So what needs to change is definitely less of this administrative and bureaucratic burden on the farmers. They spend hours and days filling out forms and justifying every single thing they do on their farms, and this is really burdensome for them. The other thing is, in fact, understanding to which extent we can expect our trading partners to respect the same production norms that our farmers respect as well. And we understand that to some extent this is possible, and we would like to encourage the European Commission that in their trade negotiations they try to make these measures enforceable for the trading partners. So I would say less burden in terms of administration and regulation, and more incentive towards more sustainability, and also trying to address the fair level playing field when it comes to our competitors from third countries.
So the final words there from Ksenia. Rodrigo, I'd like to come to you now, because there's a bigger picture about the trade in food commodities, and I think Harold mentioned it earlier that there are raw materials which are also imported. So can you tell us how standards in that area should work for producers and consumers, and any challenges with that?
Yes, I think we should start a little bit back and look at why standards emerge. I mean, where do they come from? And they come because they appear because this is due to the credence characteristics of goods. Credence characteristics are characteristics that consumers find very costly or impossible to determine even after consuming the product. For example, when you consume a bar of chocolate, do you know if it was done without child labor? When you are eating an apple, do you know if the farmers who produced it used a band or large amounts of pesticide? You don't know. And for a consumer, it's very, very difficult to find that out, because there is a basic asymmetric information problem between producers and consumers and other stakeholders that we're not going to get into. But there's a big asymmetric information problem. And standards come in as a set of rules that are designed to try to bridge this gap of asymmetric information. Now, a very important point is that there are different types of standards. You have private standards and you have public standards. And private standards are normally created by firms or NGOs, and they are normally voluntary standards, in the sense that these are firms or producers who voluntarily decide to, for example, meet these standards with using certification, third-party certification, I'll get to that in a second, to show to consumers that they have met a series of rules. And these rules apply to a lot of things: food safety, they can apply to environmental standards, to labor standards. I mean, we can meet a lot of different questions. And but these are voluntary. For example, fair trade is a good example of that, but there are many more. Rainforest Alliance, there are many voluntary standards for coffee, for cocoa, for many other products, palm oil. Okay. Then you have public standards that are normally imposed, in the sense that they are mandatory and created by governments. A clear example of this, for example, is when you have food safety standards. You remember European Union in 2005, around 2005, these standards started to become mandatory, and the different countries around the world now, they have food standards for different things. So this is where standards come from, and the differences between standards. Now, what one has to understand too is that there's a lot of heterogeneity among producers and among consumers too. So like you mentioned, there are consumers who care more about certain characteristics, others care less. For example, some will care more about price, other cares more about quality. It's a variety. And on the production side, and in particular in developing countries, we have a reality, which is that many producers, in particular smallholder producers, they're very poor in many cases. They do not have access to finance, for example, things that producers in developed countries take for granted, like access to finance or access to infrastructure or access to short value chains. That is not available in many developing countries, in particular for smallholder producers. And if you look, for example, at a product like coffee, which is smallholder dominated, I mean, the large majority of producers of coffee, for example, in countries like Colombia or Guatemala or Ethiopia or most countries that produce coffee, not all, but most, they're dominated by smallholders. So they have this problem. So one has to understand that if you are, as a producer, smallholder producer, want to meet the standard, you have to pay, because you have to meet the rules, you have to pay to have it certified. So the stronger the standard, the more difficult it is, and the higher possibility that there will be people who will be excluded from selling to certain markets. This is without any value judgment. These are facts. So when one designs these policies, one should consider that one size does not fit all, that there are different risks also, that there are different realities. So it's very important what was mentioned before, I think it was by Leah, that dialogue is very important so that people know that there are different realities and there are different constraints, that producers and consumers need to try to find common ground, and that governments, as representatives of consumers and producers, also need to intervene and try to find common ground. I think this is very important. And the final issue on this topic is that there's also a multiplicity of standards, that for the same product, let's say coffee or cocoa, any of them, there's so many different standards, even voluntary standards. So consumers many times don't know what these standards mean. Again, because it's costly for the consumer to try to find out if the standard is meeting what they want in terms of credence goods or not. So I think that is something also that there should be more dialogue and more transparency to try to make easier for consumers and producers also to be certified in multiple standards. But I'm happy to continue discussing all this topic. It's fascinating.
But I think that's really important, because coming from the consumer side, I always think about what the label or the consumer sees. And in the EU, there's been a huge amount of work tackling greenwashing and making them clear and easy to understand. But again, from the producer side, you're saying it's actually so much investment and time into like deciding which is the best one to invest in. So it's the other side of it. When we could keep talking about this for a lot longer, but we're coming to the end of the session. I wanted to just move to the final question to everybody, and I'll come to Stefano first. It's very general. You can answer it however you like. You can be controversial, or you can not. But the question is, what do you think can be done to make the global trade system work better for consumers, citizens, and producers?
As I said before, I think reciprocity is important. Of course, reciprocity has to take into account different levels of development, but at the same time, different levels of development, as we said before, didn't allow for, infringing intellectual property or damaging the environment or child labor or other issues. So I think we should have this principle that is I think the pillar of a real fair trade enforced, and this is the question, in my opinion, because we lack enforcement, notwithstanding all the efforts, of course, the WTO and or the dialogue that we were speaking about. But basically, I think we lack that. And unfortunately, the spiral is towards more protectionism, more mercantilism, and not acknowledging the benefits of a real global and free trade.
It's interesting, in so many of these start talking, we often conclude that agreeing the rules is difficult, but it's possible. But actually enforcing them is the thing that's really challenging and really expensive and time consuming. So that's interesting that you raised that here as well. Harold, that question to you, what can be done to make the system work better for everybody? So not just your members, but consumers and...
Sorry, I still had to unmute. Well, I think the discussion today really showed that trade can be beneficial for consumers. And I'm just quoting Commission figures, and Leah might challenge them probably, but the Commission estimated that on average, the consumer saves around 600 euros per year through existing trade agreements. So I think there is still more work to do in the future, but let me also say that it is important that rules that have been agreed need to be complied with. So we also see consumers directly buying from third countries, overseas, and I think we all have to make sure that products are safe and rules are not circumvented. But that doesn't change the key message that opening up a trade is still beneficial for consumers.
Okay. Rodrigo, for you, what can make it work better?
Well, I think that, as mentioned, multi-stakeholder approaches are the key. I think that you have to have dialogue, but real dialogue with people listen and people talk and they share information, especially data, showing what is the impact, expected impact, because you don't know in advance, of different measures. And I'll give you a small example of something that we have been working on. It's of the technical challenges that finding solutions to this have. For example, addressing compatibility of different digital traceability standards. There are different traceability solutions. For example, to trace from farm to fork. Which one will be chosen? That requires sitting down, comparing, dialoguing, and reaching agreements. And that is very challenging. Because that has something that has clear implications. How will these standards or how will these solutions will be applied? That is something that there's plenty of work to do, and I think that the multilateral approach and multilateral organizations have quite a big role to play there.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonino. A question to you.
I think that something I've mentioned before. Consumers need to be a key player here, and we are not a key player. So we need to be there. About information, it was mentioned here many times. I think that we lack information to participate. Many of the trade agreements or trade negotiations are secret, so you don't know what is happening. So when you don't know what is happening, in my case, I can be quite dubious about the outcome. Say, why are you not saying this to me? This is something obscure down there. I can understand some things in relation with governments negotiating, but when you start just closing doors, it's just like, And the other last thing is that we don't have to forget that the digital economy brings another reality for consumers. Now, we in our countries are traders. We can buy things from all over the world all the time with a click on our mouth. So that's why also we need to be heard on that.
Thanks very much, Antonino. Leah, the final words from you. What can be done to improve trade?
Thank you very much. Well, the final word would be that it's not only trade. We need to look at the full picture, and we need to have strong protection for and society at large, so consumers and company at first at domestic level, and then we need to have also trade agreements that are looking at benefiting and bringing concrete benefit, not only like very far-fetched benefit, but concrete benefits to consumers, to company, to the whole economy. Really, that's something that we're missing on top of the transparency aspect that Antonino just mentioned. And I completely also agree with the colleagues that we also need to look at the enforcement part of the different laws, of the different trade agreements. And we just had in Europe now a vote on the customs reform, for instance. I don't know if Harold will agree, but that I find very positive, also to tackle issues like product safety and imports that are not compliant with the EU product safety rules or sustainability rules. So and that then will require a lot of dialogue among different parts to make sure that we can do this without geopolitical tensions that can ultimately be detrimental for consumers and companies at large.
Thank you very much. And I had a comment in from a viewer who calculates the carbon footprint and impact of any trade deals. So perhaps that should be the data that's also brought to these discussions, because that's crucially important. Okay, we're going to bring it to a close now. Thank you so much, Stefano, Harold, Leah, Antonino, and Rodrigo. Thank you for your time and for helping to make what can be quite a complex, abstract topic into something that's quite meaningful, not just for businesses, but for consumers as well. Thanks to everyone watching back and who's been joining in as well. Next month, we're going to mark International Women's Day a couple of days earlier with a webinar on the 6th of March, all about how women and including them in products and policy and services and design can help power a more safe, sustainable and more equitable marketplace. Until then, you can watch back any of our previous webinars on the website, which is here. So all of them are there. As I say, we've got 2 years worth now of fascinating discussions with speakers, just like the 5 we have here today. Oh, thank you very much, Christine. That's very kind of you. So it's time for me to say goodbye. Remember, you can follow @Euroconsumers on Twitter or X and LinkedIn and keep up with all the latest news and all the rest of the Start Talking webinars. Thanks ever so much, everybody. Goodbye.
Power to the people, someone used to sing. And while singing is not our expertise, empowering people, empowering you is what we do. And in tune. How? We test, analyze and compare products and services to ensure that they meet what you are looking for and comply with the law. We inform, advise, support and represent consumers, and we do this in chorus, which is to say in several countries at the same time. Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal and Brazil. Then we dialogue, collaborate and sue companies if needed to make sure people's and your needs are in the best hands. And in the end, we improve the market and we all win. Maybe it does deserve a song. What do you think? Euroconsumers. Empower people, improve the market.